It all began with a single letter, a crisp white envelope tucked neatly into the mailbox, stamped with the bold insignia of the neighborhood HOA. At first glance, it looked harmless, maybe even routine. But inside was a fine. A fine for something so trivial, it almost felt like a joke. The HOA claimed that the color of my mailbox didn't meet their community standards. They demanded I repaint it, immediately, or pay a penalty. At first, I laughed it off. I had lived in this neighborhood for nearly a decade. My lawn was well kept, my house pristine, and I'd never had any issues with anyone. But the tone of the letter wasn't polite. It was condescending, the kind of bureaucratic power play that hides behind rules and regulations. Still, I decided to comply. I repainted the mailbox, sent them a receipt, and moved on. But it didn't stop there. 2 weeks later came another notice. This time, they fined me for having my trash cans visible from the street for too long after pickup day. Then, a warning for unapproved lawn ornaments. Then, another for slightly overgrown grass. It was relentless, almost like they had singled me out. Every letter arrived with the same cold language, every fine came with a threat of escalation. I tried to reason with them through emails and letters, explaining that I was following the rules. But it didn't matter. The responses were robotic, full of jargon about community image and mandatory compliance. I began to notice that only certain neighbors were getting targeted, mostly those who didn't attend HOA meetings or who dared to question the board's decisions. Soon, whispers started circulating. The HOA president, a retired real estate agent named Barbara, had apparently developed a taste for control. Residents quietly complained about her power trips, but no one challenged her openly. She was strict, proud, and intimidating, the kind of person who believed authority was proof of superiority. And under her, the HOA had become more like a dictatorship than a community organization. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright orange tag stuck to my front door, a notice of violation. They claimed my driveway had oil stains that needed immediate cleaning or I'd face another fine. That was the breaking point. My driveway was spotless. I realized this wasn't about rules anymore, it was about control. I started looking deeper. I attended my first HOA meeting in years, quietly sitting in the back as the board discussed neighborhood issues. They spent an hour debating the visual impact of a resident's basketball hoop. Another 30 minutes discussing the shade of a front door. I watched as Barbara ran the room like a queen in her castle, dismissing anyone who dared to speak against her. The board members nodded obediently, agreeing with every word she said. That night, I decided I was done being a victim. I began researching how HOAs actually worked, the laws, the bylaws, the structure of ownership. I was surprised to learn that the HOA wasn't some untouchable government entity. It was, in fact, a corporation, one that could be legally purchased, managed, and even dissolved under certain conditions. The idea started as a fantasy, a quiet daydream born of frustration. What if I could turn the tables? What if I could stop their harassment not by fighting them directly, but by taking over the system they used to control everyone? I spent nights reading through legal documents, state statutes, and financial reports. I found that the HOA had a serious flaw: low participation. Very few homeowners actually voted in elections or attended meetings. Most didn't care, they just paid their dues and stayed out of trouble. That apathy had allowed Barbara and her small group to keep total control. But that also meant they were vulnerable. The first step was understanding their finances. Through the association's public records, I found their operating budget, the list of property management companies they used, and, most importantly, their outstanding debts. They owed a significant amount to a landscaping contractor, and the reserve fund was dangerously low. Then came the breakthrough. One of the local management companies had been negotiating with the HOA to take over operations because of the unpaid bills. That gave me an opening, a legal one. If I could become a major financial stakeholder or secure enough voting rights, I could influence, and possibly own, the HOA's controlling interests. What started as a series of petty fines had turned into a mission. I stopped reacting to their letters. Instead, I started planning. I quietly reached out to a few neighbors who had also been unfairly fined. I listened to their stories, each one worse than mine. A retired couple fined for having a birdbath too close to their front door. A single mother threatened with foreclosure for missing one payment by a week. The community was fed up, just too scared to act. I promised them I would find a way. And I meant it. As weeks passed, I collected more information. I began attending every meeting, taking notes, observing dynamics. The more I learned, the clearer it became. Barbara had built her little empire on fear and silence. But numbers and laws didn't care about intimidation. And then, one day, an opportunity presented itself. The HOA's management contract was up for renewal, and they needed bids. I knew this was my window. With the right move, and the right company, I could put myself in a position to gain control. The fines that once felt like harassment now looked like motivation. The same system that had tried to punish me was about to become my greatest advantage. I had no idea how far this plan would go, but one thing was certain, I wasn't backing down. The HOA thought they could fine me into silence. Instead, they had just started a chain reaction that would change everything. The day after that fateful meeting, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. The HOA had crossed a line, and I was done reacting to their power games. From now on, I would play my own, quietly, strategically, and with one goal in mind, to take control. My first move was to gather allies. The HOA functioned like a small company, and just like any company, it could be influenced by those who cared enough to participate. Most homeowners didn't realize that their votes mattered, that board members could be replaced, budgets could be questioned, and contracts could be overturned. The board thrived on apathy. I was going to turn that apathy into action. I started by visiting my neighbors one by one. Some were hesitant to even open their doors when they saw the HOA papers I carried. They thought I was there to issue fines. But once I explained what I discovered, how the HOA was legally structured, how decisions could be changed with a simple majority, they began to listen. I learned that fear had silenced most of them. Barbara had built a culture of intimidation, where questioning her meant retaliation. But now, they saw someone standing up, not with loud protests, but with knowledge and a plan. By the end of that week, I had 10 homeowners ready to attend the next meeting. It might not sound like much, but in an HOA where barely 5 people usually showed up, that was an army. Meanwhile, I was working another angle. I reached out to the landscaping company the HOA was in debt to. I asked them if they were still waiting on payment. They were, and they were frustrated. I offered to settle the debt personally, in exchange for something small, their voting rights on the unpaid lien they held against the HOA's account. It was perfectly legal, and it gave me leverage. A week later, I officially became the largest creditor the HOA had. That meant they couldn't make certain decisions without notifying me. Suddenly, Barbara's iron control had a crack in it. The next meeting was different. When Barbara walked in, she immediately sensed something was off. The seats were full, homeowners she hadn't seen in years. She tried to conduct business as usual, rattling off minor violations and collecting votes from her board, but this time, we questioned everything. We asked about the budget. The maintenance fees. The reserve funds. Every question made her more uncomfortable. When she refused to share financial details, I calmly reminded her that state law required transparency from all HOA boards. She tried to dismiss me, but the neighbors spoke up. For the first time, the room wasn't silent. That night didn't end with victory, but it ended with awareness, and that was enough. The neighborhood was waking up. Over the following month, I kept building. I reviewed the HOA's bylaws line by line, looking for weaknesses. That's when I found the key, a clause stating that if a majority of homeowners petitioned for a vote of no confidence in the board, they could trigger a full re-election. The clause had been ignored for years, buried in the paperwork. But it was still valid. All I needed were signatures, 51% of the homeowners. I spent weeks knocking on doors, having long talks in driveways, explaining how the HOA's funds were misused and how fines had skyrocketed under Barbara's control. Some were skeptical, others afraid, but the evidence spoke for itself. Late fees, unnecessary contracts, inflated maintenance costs, it was all there, written in the very documents the HOA had tried to keep hidden. Eventually, the signatures started to come in. Quietly. Secretly. Neighbors slipped envelopes under my door at night. Some left them in my mailbox, unsigned on the outside for safety. One by one, the fear began to fade. When I finally reached the required number, I filed the petition formally. The law was clear, the board had 30 days to organize a special meeting for new elections. Barbara was furious. She sent out letters accusing me of disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood, claiming I was undermining community values. But her words no longer held power. People saw through it. The special meeting was tense. Every seat was filled, every eye watching as ballots were cast. Barbara still believed she could win. After all, she'd ruled for years without challenge. But when the votes were counted, the result was undeniable, she and her board were out. I was elected as the new HOA president. The room erupted in quiet disbelief. Barbara stormed out before the results were even finalized. It should have felt like victory, but I knew it was just the beginning. Taking the position was one thing, changing the system was another. The HOA's books were a mess. Debts everywhere, no oversight, and plenty of questionable payments. I spent days combing through the records, trying to piece together what had happened. The more I found, the clearer it became, Barbara had been using HOA funds for personal projects. Landscaping upgrades that only benefited her street. Maintenance contracts that doubled as favors for friends. Then, an even bigger discovery, the HOA's management company had been overcharging for years, funneling inflated invoices through a shell contractor. I followed the paper trail and realized the HOA was on the brink of financial collapse. That's when the idea struck me again, the same wild thought I'd had weeks ago when I first learned the HOA was a corporation. If I could acquire enough of its debt, if I could legally become its primary financial stakeholder, then I wouldn't just run the HOA. I would own it. I called my lawyer, the same one who had helped me interpret the bylaws earlier. He confirmed it, under certain state statutes, an HOA could be restructured or even absorbed into a new management entity if its ownership or debt structure shifted significantly. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. That's when the real plan began. I reached out to every vendor, contractor, and service provider the HOA owed money to. I made offers to buy their liens and debts for discounted rates. Most agreed, they just wanted to be paid something instead of waiting indefinitely. Within a few months, I had accumulated over 70% of the HOA's outstanding financial obligations under my name. And with that, I held the keys to everything. Barbara's regime had once ruled through fear and manipulation. Now, her empire rested on my desk, a stack of papers and signed contracts that made me the legal owner of the HOA's controlling interests. I hadn't just joined the system. I had become it. The same HOA that had fined me into frustration was now mine to command. But as the weight of that reality settled in, I began to see what came next wouldn't be about revenge, it would be about redemption. The neighborhood needed rebuilding, trust needed restoring, and the system needed reform. I had taken back power, but now, I had to decide how to use it. Owning the HOA changed everything. Overnight, I went from being the community's most fined resident to the person responsible for every rule, every regulation, every dollar spent. What had started as an act of retaliation now carried real responsibility. The same authority that had once been abused was now in my hands, and I was determined not to repeat the same mistakes. My first act as owner and president was transparency. I opened the HOA's books for everyone to see. We organized a neighborhood meeting, not in the stuffy clubhouse but on the open lawn where everyone felt welcome. I laid it all out, the debts, the overspending, the mismanagement, even the fines that had been unfairly issued. For years, people had been kept in the dark, too afraid or too tired to question the system. That night, they finally saw the truth. Neighbors who had been silent for years began to speak up. They shared their frustrations, their stories of being bullied, their fears of losing their homes over minor violations. As I listened, I realized just how deep the damage ran. The HOA wasn't just broken on paper, it had broken people's trust. And trust, once lost, is the hardest thing to rebuild. I started by canceling unnecessary contracts. The overpriced landscaping deals, the redundant maintenance services, the suspicious, consulting fees, they all went. I hired a small local company to handle maintenance at fair rates, saving the community thousands each month. I eliminated arbitrary fines and replaced them with a friendly notice system. Instead of threats, homeowners received reminders and offers for help. The changes were small at first, but they spread fast. Neighbors who once hid behind their curtains started chatting again in driveways. Lawns were greener, not because of fines, but because people felt proud again. The fear that once hovered over the neighborhood began to fade. Still, I knew Barbara wouldn't disappear quietly. She had moved out of the neighborhood shortly after losing the election, but word got around that she was planning to sue. She claimed I had illegally acquired HOA assets. Her lawyer sent letters, threats, even a formal complaint to the county office. But my paperwork was airtight. Every purchase, every transfer, every debt acquisition had been legal and transparent. In the end, she dropped her claims quietly, not because she wanted to, but because she had no case. With that chapter closed, I focused on rebuilding the HOA into something better, something fair. I rewrote the bylaws entirely. No more vague, community appearance, clauses or personal preferences disguised as regulations. Every rule was rewritten in plain English, approved by homeowner votes, and designed to serve the people, not control them. One of the biggest reforms was creating a resident fund. Instead of hoarding fees in a misused reserve account, part of the HOA dues now went back into community projects, new benches, playground repairs, and seasonal events. For the first time in years, the neighborhood started feeling like a community again. It wasn't all smooth. Some resisted the changes. A few people missed the old, strict, way of doing things, believing that control meant order. But gradually, even they saw the benefits. When property values started rising again, not because of forced conformity but because of genuine pride, the new system proved itself. Months passed, then a year. The same neighbors who once feared the HOA now volunteered to help with cleanups, barbecues, and events. Kids played in the streets without anyone complaining about noise violations. The tension that once filled every corner had been replaced by laughter and small acts of kindness. One evening, as I stood on my porch watching the sunset over the rows of homes, I thought back to that first letter, the one that had started it all. The fine for a mailbox color. A small, ridiculous thing that had spiraled into a war for control. I smiled at the irony. What had once felt like a personal battle had turned into something much bigger, a lesson in how power works, and how easy it is to abuse it when no one pays attention. Barbara had ruled through fear, and I had overthrown her through knowledge. But the real victory wasn't in taking control, it was in giving it back. Over time, I stepped down from the presidency. The HOA didn't need one person to run it, it needed a community to keep it alive. We set up a rotating board with limited terms and public oversight. Every financial decision required open approval. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair, and that was enough. Before leaving my role, I used my remaining ownership rights to transfer the HOA's corporate structure into a community trust. That meant no one could ever own the HOA again. It belonged entirely to the residents, permanently. The era of control and fines was over. A few weeks later, a new letter arrived in my mailbox. This time, it wasn't a fine. It was a thank you note, signed by nearly every homeowner. They thanked me for bringing peace back to the neighborhood, for standing up when no one else would, for showing that one person could change everything. As I read it, I realized something important. Revenge had started my journey, but redemption had finished it. What began as a battle against an unfair system had turned into a movement to rebuild trust and fairness. The HOA that once tried to fine me into silence had become the very symbol of community I had always hoped it could be. That night, I walked past my once controversial mailbox. The same color as before, still standing, still mine. A reminder that sometimes the smallest things can lead to the biggest changes, if you refuse to back down. The HOA had tried to fine me. But instead, I bought it. And in doing so, I bought back something even more valuable, my peace, my pride, and my community.